A single ring radiates a cold, searching hunger across ages, and where its shadow falls a new kind of light arrives, a mind famed for sight unseen. Sherlock Holmes, summoned by rumor and reason, steps from fog into legend to treat the One Ring as the most dangerous case of his career. It begins in a weather older than smoke. The streets of London are a theater of damp and gas, yet there comes the whisper that travels farther than any steed or ship. A whisper borne by raven, by thought, by the slow wheel of stars. Men of lore and craft speak of a stranger whose life is a ledger of deduction, and Gandalf the Grey, who walks both roads of men and ways of the unseen, follows that whisper with a slow, knowing smile. He finds Holmes in a narrow room where tobacco curls like questions, and where a violin's cry stitches up the night. The old wizard speaks in parables, Holmes answers in the clean arithmetic of observation. Neither yields entirely. One night, with the thunder of other worlds in his beard, Gandalf lays before Holmes a map not of geography but of consequence. And Holmes, who measures a thing by what it makes of men and how men bend to it, consents to cross a boundary he had never thought possible, not by passage of sea or by ship, but by consent of reason and the tearing of an old covenant. So he comes, not cloaked in the armor of kings nor robed like a wizard, but with a hat pulled low against rain, and with eyes that miss nothing. The passage that brings him is quiet and terrible. It is stitched of starlight and steely syllables, of old songs half remembered, and Holmes steps from it as one steps from one sickly world into another of deeper hues. The land he finds is not the London he knows. It breathes long and slow. Hills hold their memories like sleep, and every stream is a mirror for an age of trees that have watched empires rise and fall. He is a stranger among old tales, and the tales look up to behold him. Rivendell receives him, as a guest should be received, when the housekeeper of memory opens her doors. Elrond's hall gleams with art that has outlasted men, and lamps hang like captive stars. There the wise sit, and their speech is measured as a river's flow. Elrond's face holds the weight of years that remember both spring and sorrow. Gandalf is a companion of old mirth and old grief. His eyes shine the flame of one who knows many ends. Around them sit those whose stories are songs, an heir who walks stray paths and keeps silence like armor, an archer as lithe as a mountain-born wind, a dwarf whose beard is a statement of stubbornness. Hobbits, small and round, are present as well, for the matter that summons reason is carried in the heart of one who seems at first sight an unlikely bearer. Bilbo is there, perhaps a little thinner at the edges from having loved his comforts, perhaps a little sharper from an encounter with something that works by will rather than by craft. The ring lies unseen, a rumor folded into the hall like a shadow that will not be named. Holmes moves through their glances as one might move through a case room, cataloging, sorting, reducing. He notes the creases of Elrond's hand, the manner of a cloak's hem, the way Gandalf's pipe smoke remembers roads. He seeks the ring as a scent, a pattern, a trace upon the world. He listens when Elrond speaks of history, of kings and swords, of the one who wrought rings in secret, and the last act of a father who did not cast down his ring in the wreck of his realm. He asks not for myths, but for particulars. He wants to know the alloy of the metal, the shape of the engraving, the heat of its forging. He will consider motive, maker, and method as he would a murder. Who benefited, who had the skill, what instruments left their marks. Around him the elders are at once amused and alarmed. There is a caution in them to their years. The ring is an old wound. To this tall, thin man who has never sung in halls, it is a puzzle to be unraveled. When at last the ring is brought forth, it is not what any ledger might say. It is a thing of plain circlet, and yet as if a night had been narrowed into metal. It is warm where flesh meets it, and when it is turned, A script blooms along its inner face like a secret taken out of the dark. Holmes leans close, his breath fogs the light of the lamp, strikes the letters, and yet no simple hand could have drawn them. He inspects the metal, not mere gold of the ordinary markets, but a depth to it, a singing to its surface that betrays craft older than coin. He tests its weight with a finger, he listens to it as a surgeon listens to a pulse. He feels, too, that gaze, the ring's cold, searching hunger, like the prickle of a thought sliding along the spine. It is the first time in a life of observation that he is met by something that observes back. Holmes does not yield to awe. He keeps his clarity like a blade. He knows the peril of allowing desire to shape argument. It is certainly not a trinket of halfling make, he says in measured tones, and his voice is a pale bell in that ageless hall. There is intent. There is design to ensnare. The metal is wrought with a purpose that is not merely ornate. The inscription appears under certain heat or light, a cipher meant to reveal and to conceal by turns. Observe. The script reveals itself as if it were memory, not engraving. When they press him for an explanation, he speaks in images of hand and temper, and of the way craftsman's pride leaves microscopic histories along a work. There is a pause among them. The air seems to listen. Gandalf watches Holmes as one watches a new constellation. You will not be the first to peer at it and think to own it, he says softly. Power dressed as comfort has undone kings. Yet power that sees fits to hide may be slain only by longer sight. Holmes inclines his head. He knows the language of men who have seen wizardries before he understands the caution in Gandalf's syllables. Then call it what you will, he replies. I will examine the matter as I examine a crime. I shall look for motive, for maker, for method. Give me time and the right instruments. To some this seems a miracle, to others a failure of prudence. They debate whether a mind of mortal reason can stand unmoved in the presence of an artifact whose first talent is to tempt. Aragorn's jaw tightens. He thinks in the manner of one who carries a crown as a burden and the knowledge of blood as a map. Legolas tilts his head, seeing threads of possibility. Gimli regards Holmes with a scrutiny that is almost personal, for dwarven craft and Holmes' sort of sterile dissection share a language of touch. Bilbo's eyes, trained in the endurance of long acquaintance with that ring, are the most revealing. They glint with a memory of small, dear transgressions. He watches Holmes with a hobbit's simple fear, and with the secret smile of a thief who once thought himself harmless until his haven became tight with danger. Holmes sets conditions. With the crispness of law, he will not be trusted alone with the ring. The hall will provide witnesses and safeguards. The ring must be placed upon a slab of stone cooled by the stream. It must be lit and shadowed by Elrond's lamps, so that its script reveals itself under controlled variation. Instruments, too, are requested: glass of clear crystal, edge of steel, threads of hair and fiber, powders that Gandalf summons with a reluctance that is almost filial. The wizard's old lessons are not about method but about heart. Even the neatest of tests can unmask a mind where none was expected. Yet he agrees, let the sciences of the narrow man dance with the magic of old. Perhaps in such an exchange there will be a new understanding. When Holmes at last puts his gloved fingers near the ring, the hall holds its breath. This is the moment when a stranger becomes part of an old story. He does not immediately take it into his palm. He does, with a practiced gentleness, trace the air above it, noting the pattern of light and shadow as though it were the footprint of a fugitive. He applies powders that smoke like silent alarms. He holds up a lens the size of a monocle and peers into the secret script. The letters flare like frost for an instant, then shrink, then rearrange themselves into forms he cannot read. He hears, perhaps, a whisper that is not a voice but a memory of forges and of promises laid upon fire. The ring tests him with visions. A throne emptied of 1,000 strangers, a map of towers burning, the faces of friends as crowns. Holmes, whose mind prizes truth over rule, feels the tug of what might be used and what must be prevented. He records his observations with the cold hand of notation. The script is not merely a cipher, he says. It is a lure and a lock. It offers to reveal, and yet it steals the revealer. The allure of mastery is written into its very alloy. Its maker knew how to tempt. That implies a deliberate cruelty and an engineer who understood the anatomy of desire. Elrond nods, as if some ancient verdict is renewed, while Gandalf's face goes gray. For there is a nuance in Holmes' speech that acknowledges what many had only feared. The ring is not merely an artifact to be hidden. It is a living argument against security. There are small triumphs and deeper fears in Holmes' deductions. He can, with the means at hand, account for the metallurgy, a mixing that requires heat beyond the simple furnaces of Elendil or the smithies of Erebor. He can, with patience, note the pattern of where that speaks of a wearer who sought secrecy rather than display. He can, with a surgeon's courage, place a scrap of the ring's surface against a lens and note a structure in the metal that resembles a map of will. Yet for all his instruments, there are things that the ring refuses to give up. The identity of its maker and name, the full map of its cunning. For these the hall must fall back upon story and the slow remembering of things already past. As night deepens and the lamps lower their voices, the company hushes into council. The arrival of this strange mind among them has altered the old tale. It has set a fresh light upon an old wound. There is a feeling as if two kinds of knowledge must now converse. The precise, almost surgical art of Holmes and the vast, sometimes cruel patience of the Eldar. They agree at last upon a narrow beginning. Let the ring be studied, let its small betrayals be tracked. Let not a sword be raised, nor a throne be sought until they have tried the slender art of the observer. If the ring has hunger, let it be fed only by truth. Holmes accepts the charge with a steadiness that resembles prayer. He will not claim the right to unmake what was made by a will far older than his own. He will not promise salvation, but he promises knowledge. And in that room, where ages listen as if the future might depend upon the right name, knowledge is a weapon that must be wielded with care. The stranger among old tales is given a place at the circle. He will sleep not as one who conquers, but as one who keeps watch for a pattern outside. The river runs on, knowing all but speaking little. Above, the stars are as indifferent as ever. Inside, men and elves and a detective of England prepare for a contest not of swords but of seeing. The ring sleeps in its cold cradle like a secret that approaches revelation not by silence, but by the wrong answers men will give when tempted. The tale that has stood for an age now takes a turn. A case will be followed as if it were a narrow crime, and reason will move among myth. Yet even as Holmes lays out his papers and lights his pipe, the storyteller's last warning passes over the hall like a shadow. Rings do not yield to logic alone, for they were made to turn truths to knives and friends to foes. The stranger has come to solve, but the ring may itself be the sharpest eye in the room. He had come upon Middle-earth as a logical shadow, a small, bright intellect against the aged gloom, yet there are things no light dismisses. And age itself holds counsel that even deduction must heed. He walked in the wake of tales, his mind a lamp that searched for pattern where others saw omen. But the songs of Eldar and the hush of mushrooms are not mere data to be parsed. They were woven with purpose, and purpose has teeth. He had been named and described in quiet hearths. The stranger, the foreign wit, the man who smoked a pipe thin as a spyglass and wore a coat that carried the fog of London. They watched him with magnified lids. The hobbits first, curious, hospitable, suspicious in the manner of bright small folk, and later the wise, who measured him against lore rather than love. Gandalf had said little, but his eyes kept the lines of a map, and his face was like a gate that opens and closes with strange keys. Elrond, who carried rivers in his speech, received the stranger with a calm that was colder than winter and warmer than any home-fair dot from his first night under eaves carved by elders. The detective did what he had done in other worlds: listen, note, and weave hypothesis into silence. But this silence was thick with history. Each footfall woke a rhyme, each spoken name a bell. He learned of the ring not from a headline but from trembling hands, and yet the tremble told more than any headline could. It told of hunger, of cunning, of a heat that makes even the wise uncouth. He observed the smallest stains upon the mounting, the faintest curve worn into a finger, the pallor that followed a long night of watching. He marked a breath's peculiar rhythm and set it like a latch in his mind. Rumor swelled like a storm, and with rumor came other voices, soldiers with broken banners, whispers in elven gardens, a ranger's half-remembered verse, and at last a more dreadful murmur, that a gleam had been seen in the east, and a shadow had leaned to look. Holmes, if one may use the name the hobbits gave him, with the hesitant fondness of folk who make friends of strangers, did not delight in prophecy. He sought cause and effect as a hunter seeks spoor, yet cause here braided with enchantment, and effect sometimes hid in a word spoken in an older tongue. There were nights when the very air seemed tuned to listening. Moonlight lay upon the hills like a patient scabbard, and stars bore witness like placid jurors. Once, walking the gardens of Imladris, he found footprints that puzzled him, not wholly mortal nor wholly of the Eldar, as if an old thing wore a new shoe. He traced the line to a hedge where the leaves whispered themselves into gossip, and there a small ring of light lay upon a stone, cold and unadorned, yet it hummed with a memory like a song stuck between teeth. He did not touch it at once. The Eldar taught caution, and so did his reason, for some things are known better by watching than by grasping. Gandalf came then, cloak like smoke and boots like soft thunder, and his pipe burned with a private fire that spoke of old counsel. The wizard's voice did not startle the ring answered only to the world, and to the stirrings of hearts that had owned it or desired it. Holmes sat upon a bench and lit his pipe, the smoke circling like a query, and he said softly what he had long been arranging in the ledger of his mind. The voice that came forth was not merely speech, but a slow unrolling of thought. First observation, then hypothesis, then consequence, a ritual of plain cause laid bare before the old weavings of magic. He spoke of metallurgy, of tool marks hidden to the eye but faithful to the touch, of a temper of metal that could only be shaped by hands used to heat beyond hearthfires, of runes half-sighted, meant more for hunger's sleep than for language. He argued that its cunning lay not merely in its maker's will, but in the ossified habits of war and greed, a ring that promised unity but required dominion, a paradox fit to ensnare the strong and the small alike. Gandalf listened as one who hears an old tale retold with new words. Sometimes his brows arched, sometimes his hands moved as if to pluck away a thread in the air. Elrond asked where the trail might lead. Hobbits asked whether smoke tasted better with pipeweed when morning is heavy with worry. Holmes offered neither romance nor comfort. He offered patterns and predictions, and with them, a map to minimize loss. He said that to find movement one must bait stillness. To draw forth reachers by making the world look safe, he proposed feints, small fires, false reports, a baker's crate left ajar, things that would prowl the curiosity of scavengers, both mortal and less. So there was among his plans a cruelty of strategy that made some elders wince, the placing of doubt like a coin in a cup, the planting of desire where no desire had been, so that eyes would turn and hands would reveal themselves. Gandalf's smile, when it came, Was thin as a blade and soft as moss. He knew the necessity of hard counsel, and his allegiance bent toward ends rather than means. They set watches at dusk, and at the turning of the moon sent messages by falcon and by quiet-footed runner and Holmes, with a small notebook bound by string, walked between them like a surgeon who prefers to stand in the doorway and watch the body's motions. Once, under a bough heavy with starlit fruit, he saw a ranger of the north move with a care that bespoke a watchness older than his years. He noted the ranger's boot scar, the way a gauntlet bore the echo of a broken clasp, and he guessed, with precise coldness, which villages the ranger had walked, and which graves he had left with flowers. The ranger, who would be called later by other names, regarded Holmes with the steady appraisal of one who keeps vigil. He had seen cunning in faces before, and he liked cunning that did not posture but worked. Yet not all were convinced. Suspicion is a weed that grows well in old soil, and whispers began to curl like smoke in corners where laughter used to be. There came a night when torches were found plunged into the field outside the east gate, their flames guttered with sticky black that tasted of far roads, and 3 miles away a boy, with a basket of apples, confessed to seeing a hooded figure and a hand like a circle. Holmes examined the black and set it between his fingers. It smelled of iron, and of a sea that had forgotten storms. He wrapped the boy's tale into his ledger, and added an asterisk for future cross-check. The next dawn the mist lay low as an oath, and from the mist came a sound like a bell struck upon vellum, not a ring's laughter, but the thud of many feet upon old roads. Elves went to the outer fields, and returned with arrows whose feathers told of wind from the east. They brought usings of dust, and the smell of horses that smelled of other lands entirely. Holmes read their reports as an archivist reads palimpsest. Beneath the obvious lay scrubbed texts and annotations. One could see where wolves had passed after men, and where men had followed the scent of coin. He set a snare not of iron, but of story, a rumor that a certain small ring had been borrowed by a minor noble going to the south. Word traveled as it will, and the south took notice. The south sent riders with cloaks like wet night and teeth like payment. They thought themselves hunters of treasure, and their laughter held the brittle hunger of men who have bartered their days. They came in the hours before dawn, and were met with the quiet of a place that expects labor rather than war. Yet war can be disguised as trade, and trade can be armor. A skirmish took place, swift, not glorious, a tangle of cloaks and the ringing of metal on metal. Holmes watched from the hedge, his cap low, his hand stroking his pipe as if it were a metronome to the violence. When it was done, one of the riders lay with a coin in his palm, a coin that was not ring but token, and upon it were marks of a smith's guild, the like of which Holmes had seen drawn in a trade ledger with numbers that matched shipments from the east. Thus the chain from whisper to hammer grew visible, and the company prepared for what followed next. The valley held its breath as though the world had learned to listen. Holmes walked like one who maps the wind, and wherever he set his foot the grass seemed to incline a little to his knowledge. Rivendell received him with the old politeness of houses that remember their guests. Gandalf came down the stairs with a lantern in his eyes, and in that light the gray of his beard seemed to be woven of stories. Elrond said nothing at first, only watched with the patience of one who has watched seasons pass. Frodo sat very small and still, bearing a hidden bruise under his cloak. Holmes did not touch it, for he had learned that the smallest acts set great machines in motion. Instead, he set his mind to the ring's manner, its ways of speaking and of remaining secret. He took up a strip of parchment and drew with a steady hand the lines of history and hurt, noting the crossroads where fear had given purchase. Aragorn watched him like one who has seen many strangers, and Gimli grunted his approval in a manner that meant we fight if needed. Watson made his own notes, Hand-steady night came down and the stars were like small rivets in a black canopy. Without warning, a sound like a woven lament threaded the air. Cloaks brushed the stones, and something moved at the edge of hearing. Gandalf rose and the light in his hand shivered like a new dawn. Nazgul, said Gimli under his breath, and the word fell heavy as an iron door. Holmes felt old superstitions prick like splinters under his skin, but his thought was not cowed. He had other engines, the slow tools of estimation, and he set them at work to make the dark answer to light. The Nazgul moved with a hunger that was not reckoned in days, and for the first time Holmes understood what it was to stand where legend meets tactic. He laid traps of scent and sound, tiny contrivances made of oil, herbs, and the genuine coal of deceit. Masks of hearth and laughter were set upon empty pathways, and signals of false need flared like bright warnings. The Nazgul smelt and raked the false lines, and for a time the valley breathed again. Frodo covered his face with his hands, and Watson cursed softly. Both of them relieved, yet news travels with a faster wing than any plan, and a rider came with a name that bit like frost. Moriarty. The syllables settled in the hall and made the maps of suspicion fold differently. Men who traffic in cruelty and calculation had their own craft, and the idea of such a mind crossing from another world to stitch itself through Middle-earth carried a fresh dread. Holmes met that dread with the same steady curiosity that keeps a surgeon's hand quiet in the theater. "If he be here," said Holmes, "then we must find his hinge, the small thing upon which he turns a world." They followed a dozen threads, small betrayals that a careful eye reads as a seamstress reads a garment's tear. A ledger with names crossed, a smith's hand stained with foreign coin, a garrison turned blind by bribe. All these were pins in a pillow. At last they came to a black tower, and the plain below burned with forges. Men there had been taught to forget mercy, and in their midst sat a plan like a knot. Holmes moved like a blade around its threads, and with small questions he pulled a confessing answer from a smith whose hands shook. The name that tumbled into the candlelight was a thin web. Moriarty offered coin and order, and where men lack hope they take such poison. Holmes traced the lines, and each name he drew made the trap closer. They moved in silence like judges, and the final door yielded to a slender key. Within the room sat a man small as a shard, with eyes like pinpricks, and around him the bones of designs. He looked up with the calm of one who has expected curiosity and welcomed it. "So," he said, "you have come." Holmes did not raise his voice, for men like that answer best to a steady light. He set upon the table a small wrapped thing, a ring not of elven perfect work but of crooked making, and the fingers of the room stilled. Moriarty smiled slow, a smile like a calculating gear. "Curiosity," he said, "is a fine companion. Tell me then, what will you make of this toy?" Holmes looked at him, and the measure between them was as cold as any steel. "I will unmake its dominion," he said. Moriarty laughed like the rattle of a chain unmake. He repeated, amusement rimming his words, "You with your clever hands think to undo what hunger and craft have bound. Yet there is something more here than tool and metal. There is a yearning that takes shape in men's breasts. How will you cut the yearning?" Holmes answered not with theory but with plan. He set out the small pieces like a surgeon, and his fingers moved with the rest of one who has seen 100 schemes fall and learned the contours of failure. Watson stood like a bearing pillar, and Aragorn read the room like a librarian. They spoke long into a night that seemed to hold its own breath. Moriarty offered alliances and maps, and Holmes weighed each word with a calm that was almost ceremonious. "You have crossed a strange sea," Holmes said. "You have the starved patience of long distance. What do you seek in a land of rings?" Moriarty smiled thinly. "To make sense," he said, and to build a pattern where one might set a foot and never be surprised. Power is the finest of fabrics. Holmes thought of maps and compasses, of lanterns, and of the small, quiet acts that unmake patterns. Outside the tower, the wind took the night's news to the ridges. Once more, the Nazgul sounded somewhere toward the east, and for a moment the two men considered arms and violence. Aragorn and Gimli would have none of finesse where steel was called for, and their hands twitched like dogs at the thought. Yet Holmes chose another path. He bargained in time and secrecy, asking Moriarty for one small parley to be held upon neutral ground, and the other man took the bait with a grace that was almost tender. The meeting would be at dawn by Erever where stones remember. Holmes left with watchers like sentries, and in his pocket a small note that read like a charm. He walked slow, each step deliberate, and the world seemed to fold around him with expectation. Watson kept near, and there was an old friendship in their silence. The dawn came like a promise, pale and thin, and the river shone like a blade. Moriarty stood opposite him, and between them the air tasted of negotiation. Around the bend of the bank a shadow moved, and Holmes, whose mind favored the precise light, noticed the way it hesitated. There was a hint of other hands at work, a suggestion that Moriarty did not move alone. The meeting took a new shape, for even among gentlemen and villainy alliances are currency. A figure stepped forth from the reeds, and the face under the hood was one of those Frodo had once feared. Gollum slunk like a memory, and his voice was all hunger and roomy cunning. "My precious," he hissed, and the two men at the bank paused. For the ring was not merely metal, it was a pebble dropped into lives, and its ripples reached farther than any of them had thought. Moriarty smiled then, and the smile had a calculation in it deeper even than cruelty. "We will bargain," he said, soft, and Gollum whined like a cur at a master's foot. Holmes listened to the exchanges, noting the small lies that held men to their courses. He had no love for alliances with the wicked, but he had an eye for leverage, and there are moments when to hold still is the bravest act. He set into motion a plan so simple that it seemed like chance, and watched the threads take their places. The river and cold and the morning sun cut the reeds with bright knives. As the deal turned in the bank's shadow, a noise like a bell clanged from the distant tower. Moriarty flinched, and in that flinch Holmes saw his opening. "This is not your land," he said, quiet, "and you have designing hands that understand the value of retreat." Moriarty smiled with the patience of a man who has spent his life on slow roads, but he nodded, for a bargain met another, and even the sharpest minds fear the cold of too much exposure. They parted then, not enemies.